From Redemption Church of Houston, a radically inclusive community of hope, seeking to lead Jesus-centered lives, this podcast shares sermons from our Sunday gatherings. These sermons center on God's work in the world. Hello, I'm Sam, and I serve as our treasurer. Giving to this radically inclusive community is always by invitation, not obligation. To explore ways you can support our work as a church, visit redemptionhou.com/give. Your giving helps us exist as a place where people who may have considered giving up on church can find robust hope and authentic community. Thank you. This sermon exists within a collection titled With Her, Forgotten Stories of Women God Remembered. By selecting this sermon in particular, maybe you have wonderings about what resistance looks like within a Jesus-centered life. If we're being honest, it can often feel as if nothing can stand in the way of tyrants and empires. In light of this, what could God be inviting us into? Before diving into this topic, let's take a moment to be still, to breathe, and to become aware of the present moment. Now a reading from the book of Exodus. Now these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob. They came, each one with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. All the people who descended from Jacob were 70 people, but Joseph was already in Egypt. And Joseph died, and all his brothers, and all that generation. But the sons of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly and multiplied and became exceedingly mighty, so that the land was filled with them. Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph, and he said to his people, "Behold, the people of the sons of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, otherwise they will multiply, and in the event of war they will also join those who hate us, and fight against us and depart from the land." So they appointed taskmasters over them to oppress them with hard labor. And they built for Pharaoh storage cities, Pithom and Ramesses. But the more they oppressed them, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread out, so that they dreaded the sons of Israel. The Egyptians used violence to compel the sons of Israel to labor, and they made their lives bitter with hard labor in mortar and bricks, and at all kinds of labor in the field. All their labors which they violently had them perform as slaves. Then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah, and the other was named Puah. And he said, "When you are helping the Hebrew women to give birth and see them upon the birth stool, it is a son, then you shall put him to death. But if it is a daughter, then she shall live." But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt had commanded them, but let the boys live. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this thing and let the boys live?" The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife can get to them." So God was good to the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very mighty. And because the midwives feared God, he established households for them. The word of God for us, the people of God.
So we were, every Sunday we gather in here. It's been a tradition from Redemption's beginning, I believe, where on a Sunday morning, anyone who's kind of involved in that Sunday is invited to come and just spend some time praying and seeking prayer for one another and then praying for you guys. And so every Sunday when you come in here, you've been prayed for, which is pretty cool. And I want y'all to be encouraged by that. But I also want y'all to know that so much of what we end up praying for y'all are prayers that we have for ourselves. And one of the things that has been coming up most recently over and over and over again is just this sense of feeling overwhelmed by so much of what's going on globally. We had this brief discussion this morning about the futility or the benefits of doom scrolling. And how much do we really need to be informed, and how much is choosing to not be informed just burying our heads in the sand, and what do we do with all of this? But it's a difficult and challenging time to be a human being in the United States of America in 2025. And I want to just acknowledge that, and I want to speak to that pretty directly because I think God is going to speak to that pretty directly this morning. What we are experiencing is something unique in that after the fall of the Berlin Wall, we all thought we were entering into this new age of human civilization that was going to be marked by peace and civil discourse. This was what is known as Fukuyama's end of history, that humanity had arrived at the end of its ideological evolution, that we had reached the pinnacle of human government, and it was liberal democracy. And we just thought that soon the rest of the world was going to see the benefits of this, and we're all going to step into this, and we're going to live in one nice united harmony. And we will sing, "We are the world. We are the children," right? It'll be great. I auditioned for the music team, and they said no. I don't know why. But the unraveling of this reality is not going to be unpacked this morning, but I just want to point to the fact that so much angst of what you're experiencing is the angst of being born into a world that was on the way up, and now finding yourself living in a time that feels like it's very much on the way down. It comes in living what many are saying is the most turbulent global political climate since the 1930s. And I hear the 40s were great for the world. I don't know. But things like populism exploding all over the world, and with that, a return to authoritarianism. It feels like a good idea to put egoistic people in charge of things. And liberal democracy itself seems to be failing as you and I watch it devolving into ideological tribalism. So much of what we're seeing and feeling is that we were born into democracy, but we're waking up in the reality that this all just feels a lot like empire. This just feels a lot like what has always gone on in the history of the world. And at one point in our childhood, our oh so sweet and innocent and distant childhood, it felt like maybe we had somehow found something that was other than that, different than that, more hopeful than that, more human than that. And now we doom scroll and we see just the unraveling of all of that. And I don't know if the scales are falling off of our eyes and we're just seeing the world for what the world has always been, or if the world is just getting worse, or what. But it's just a lot. It's a lot for you to have to deal with. It's a lot for you to have to figure out how to live a life in and navigate. And we haven't even talked about the fact that we're still coming out of a pandemic that happened 5 years ago. You still have to navigate things like career changes and exploring a new job that has better benefits and getting your kids to school and making sure they're in the right school. And oh my God, is HISD also falling apart? Should I move my kid to a private school? Well, there's going to be vouchers soon. Will there be? I don't know. We can't even figure out how to use our phones, and AI is going to take over the world. It's just a lot, right? It's a lot. So what does it mean for you to come into a place like this and try to just be for a minute and figure out what it looks like to live a Jesus-centered life in this sort of world? A world that I'm going to call this morning, for the sake of simplicity, empire. A world that's in transition, a world that seems to be reminding us all of what the world really is and really always has been. And I want to lovingly point you to your vocation as Christians, as people who are compelled by Jesus Christ, or have been wooed by Jesus Christ, or at least intrigued by Jesus Christ. And I want to point you to the reality that your vocation is to go out into the world and be the church. Now, I know that sort of thing is like a 4-letter word, if you could take a sentence and make it a 4-letter word these days. But I want to unpack a little bit of what that means and what that means for you personally this morning. You are the church, and that means that you stand as an alternative polis in the world. You stand in an alternative kingdom against the empire. A people who don't just commune with God, but who enter into worship week after week and are transformed by that communion, which means that you are a people who are brought out of empire and live into Jesus' reign. And so that means that you go from being a people of violence to a people of peace. You go from being a people of transaction to being a people of grace, a people of hatred to a people of love, a people of tribalism to a people of unity. And simply being that in the world, especially right now, is going to feel confrontational. It's going to feel hard. It's going to feel like resistance, because it is. And so if you want to know what it means for you to be the church, it means that you are being sent out by a good and generous God who is asking you to live contrary to just about everything that is around you, while still very much being a part of all of it. Welcome to church. And one of the ways that God forms us in our imaginations is through stories. And for a couple of weeks at the beginning of the fall, we're looking at some stories of women that have often either been overlooked, their stories haven't really been told or explored very deeply. There may be women that you've never heard of or stopped long enough to pay attention to. And in some cases, they're stories that we've mistold. And so we're going to take some time and we're going to listen for the ways that God might speak to us through the stories of how God was with these women. And these are people who I want to point out that these women, given their cultural and historical location, existed in a world with very few options on the table for them. They did not have the opportunities, the levers to pull that most of the men in these stories did. And yet we see over and over and over and over again how God shows up with and through these women in profound and amazing ways. And so this morning we have the honor to hear the story of the midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, and their bold resistance of empire. Now these midwives were likely either stand-ins, right? So they represent the midwives as a collective, or these were like the chief midwives of the Hebrew people. It is very unlikely that there were only 2 midwives for all of the Hebrew people because they were breeding like rabbits. There were babies being born, okay? This is part of the story. That this small band of 70 or so members named Israel had fled famine in their land and through God's providence had found refuge in the empire, Egypt. And there they were experiencing echoes of Genesis and creation all over again. This was God's blessing that was causing them to flourish, to be fruitful, and to multiply. And the Egyptian empire, personified by its strongman Pharaoh, did what just about every empire does to immigrants when they begin to show signs of human flourishing. It oppressed them in order to try and profit off of them while stamping them out. This is what empire does. And so when this didn't work, Pharaoh decides to exploit them in another way, by killing the baby sons of the Hebrews. This would not immediately affect the economic reality of having enslaved many of these males. And the benefits would be that we would get to keep their women. We could use them as household slaves, and we could use them as concubines, and we could over time breed out the Hebrew people. And so the king of Egypt tells the Hebrew midwives in the midst of birth, when you see it is a son, to kill the child rather than helping birth it. But these midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, were told in Exodus chapter 1, verse 17, they feared God. And they did not do as the king of Egypt had commanded them, but they let the boys live. Which reminds me of something my daughter keeps telling me about my youngest son. Let him live, Dad. Just let him live. Let him live his life. Okay. That has nothing to do with anything other than my mind keeps going back to that. But at the heart of this story, right, the verse 17 here, this moment is when we really get cut to the point, cut to the moral of the story, cut to the real fiber and fabric of what makes these women so incredible. And it's the fact that they feared God. I'm also thinking of Hard Knocks from like 10 years ago where DeAndre Hopkins does something to someone and says, "I fear God, homie." But that's a dated reference. I think it can be easy to, when we talk about fear, it can be easy to mistakenly hear some corner preacher with a sign saying, "Hey, you better turn or you're going to burn," kind of thing. And so when you hear that they feared God, we can hear this in a way that is coming through these like doom and gloom preachers. And it's not really accurate and fair to what the Hebrew scriptures are actually trying to get at here. For us to fear God in the ancient world has to do with allegiance. It has to do with like where you think power lies, like real power, like substantive power, power that's going to take care of you. You feared what you trusted, not just afraid of what that thing or person might do to you, but understanding that what it does for you and the implications that come with leaving it. And so there's a contrast being played here between fearing Pharaoh, who was the most powerful human being in the world, in charge of the most powerful empire in the world at the time. Should we fear him, the one who has every single resource at his disposal? Or should we fear this God that we haven't heard from in some 400 years? The God of the slaves, the God of the Hebrews, the God that seems to not be around and very active currently. And fearing Pharaoh would not just mean fear of what resisting him would include, which would certainly be punishment and death, but fear of Pharaoh would have also meant that when you resist him, you miss out. When you resist Pharaoh, you don't get to be a part of Pharaoh and empire. You don't get to be an insider. You don't get all the benefits that come with being an insider. Instead, you are oppressed by it. These women fear God. And it can be easy for us to hear this story and to praise these women without considering the absolutely horrifying position that they have been put in. And the story is told in such a simplistic and black and white way on purpose because it's trying to make a point about God and it's trying to make Pharaoh look really silly. But the historical reality would have been daunting for these women who are staring in the face of the most powerful empire and most powerful person in the world who is saying, you are going to go and do this horrific thing to your own people, and then being put in that position to have to ask the question, what in the world should I do? And they fear God. And they choose to understand that they are placing their fate in God's hands over against Pharaoh's hands. And in doing this, they firmly plant themselves in the realm of what God is up to in the world, which was blessing and multiplying the Hebrew people. So they are now going to enter into God's work. And so Shiphrah and Puah's fear of God lead them to join God in God's work, which meant refusing to join empire in its work. It was a binary. It was an either-or sort of situation. And so the language that's used of the midwives that I so affectionately hear my daughter saying every time I read it, let them live. Like in English, so this is like a passive, I'm going to nerd out for just a second, 2 seconds, okay? So this is like a passive word in Hebrew, and so in English, we're bringing that into passive, like you should let them live. But like, that's not really how the word works, and that's not really how midwifery works. And as many of you like in this room have regular dealings in delivery rooms, you know that the picture of the midwives just sitting back and not doing anything is actually laughable here. They were not just sitting back and letting the kids live, as in they were not just sitting back and letting the boys be born and not killing them, but instead they are actively participating in bringing these boys to life and birthing them into the world. This is an active, nurturing presence that does not just abstain, but enters into. It nurtures. It is doing something positive for these infants as they're being brought into the world. And in this way, the midwives are co-creators with God. They are entering into and partnering with God in God's work of multiplying the Hebrew people in this incredible way. And this has echoes of resurrection in it. This word, let them live, it is a breathing life into something. And so they are co-laborers. both with the Hebrew women as they deliver their children, but more so with the God of the Hebrew slaves, the God of creation, the one who brings life into the world, the God of the midwives. And in the same way that they don't take the place of the mother in the co-laboring process, but they join in what the mother's doing, they're becoming partners with God. They're not responsible for God's work. They are partnering with God's work. They're not in charge of it. They're not credited with it, but they are very much invited deeply into it. Co-creators, and in this instance, co-liberators. It's really cool. It's really, really beautiful. And we see that in all of this, God was with these women and all the midwives who would have been in their charge. And so their fear of God pays off. They end up having placed their eggs in the right basket, so to speak. And the story that follows is one of a people who exists because of these women's refusal to take part in empire. Womanist scholar Wilda Gaffney says that they are the mothers of a revolution waged by women. They likely enlisted untold numbers of birthing women and expectant mothers in their resistance movement. But it was their fear of God and a willingness to live into God's world that led them to their refusal to live into empire's world. They weren't resisting empire for the sake of resisting empire. They were living into something else. And so the church exists as an alternative to the world, not because the world's bad, but because the world is deeply loved by God. And God is at work in the world to make it new. And so we are our community who insist that Jesus is Lord, not Pharaoh, not Caesar, not Donald Trump, and not any other head of state that you can imagine. Jesus Christ is Lord. Jesus Christ reigns over all of this. Now, I know that that can be really hard to believe and really hard to live into. There's a lot worth being afraid of. There is no promise that things won't get worse. There's no promise that if you just say Jesus is Lord, suddenly you'll win the lottery and all your problems will go away. Fearing God means understanding that the ultimate source of meaning and power does not come from tyrants. It does not come from anyone but God. They don't get to write the end of the story. Jesus Christ does. It's at this point that it feels worth noting that the way Shiphrah and Puah's story ends. We left it out of our reading this morning intentionally, but I want you to hear it now. After they step in and boldly enter into this act of courage of saving these boys, Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, every son who is born, you're to throw them into the Nile, but every daughter you are to keep alive. The exodus of God's people begins with the resistance of Shiphrah and Puah, but they would be forced to stand by and watch the empire throw the very sons that they had nurtured into the world, into the Nile. They resisted the empire, but they did not overthrow it. They did not topple it. The empire continued its reign, probably relatively unfazed. This would have been an easy thing for the Pharaoh to just the next day say, you know what, let the soldiers do it. And it would have been done. In the face of the courageous acts of justice, injustice remained firmly in place, and Pharaoh continued to rule, and oppression ruled with him. And Israel was stripped of their identity as the chosen people of Yahweh, helplessly enslaved, and they were left with nothing but groans, cries. And it's these groans and cries in Exodus chapter 2 that go up into the presence of their God like a sacrifice. And God hears their cries, and God steps into the story in a pretty dramatic way, if you know how the rest of this story goes. It was only later, when the God of the slaves hears and responds to these cries, that we see real and full deliverance come. I think it's important for us to remember that we can make the mistake of believing that our work is to make the world new. As much as I would love for that to be the case, that is a task that is far too big for you. It's not ours to do, it's God's. Our work is to lead the sort of lives that keep the one who is making all things new at the center. And this will mean living into the reality that Jesus reigns over all of the powers and principalities, all the politicians and political parties. Jesus is over all authorities and rulers and empires, even those final tyrants, sin and death, that still seem to have such a stranglehold on the world. And so this will mean that your acts of good deeds and justice work will feel small and insignificant in the face of empire. But Jesus is still inviting us to see where God is at work in our lives and in the lives of those around us, and to join him in it. This is your leaving this place and showing up in the world, to the world, with the world, standing firmly in allegiance to the resurrected Jesus. This is your source of true resistance. And it will take on a number of different realities in your life. What you are called and invited to do by God is not necessarily what I will be called and invited to do by God. It was a tipped cap, which was one of the first pebbles to roll in the later avalanche that undid apartheid in South Africa. A tipped cap. In the 1940s, colonial South Africa, a white man named Trevor Huddleston tipped his cap to a black woman, a domestic worker nonetheless, in a hospital for the blind. In their world, he was the highest of the high, a cleric, an official, a white male with status. She was the lowest of the low, a black woman who worked in a hospital, a black woman who worked in the hospital with children that no one wanted. And he chose to tip his cap to her. In this gesture, which is largely lost on us because we don't really wear caps and we don't tip them when we do, he's acknowledging her dignity. But beyond that, he's treating her like not just an equal, as someone who deserves honor. And in this single small act, Huddleston acknowledges her dignity, her value, her inherent loveliness that many other white South Africans were blind to. The gesture was driven by the fact that Trevor Huddleston was an Anglican priest, and he believed that Jesus Christ reigned over all things. His Lord had given himself to Huddleston in love, and this was also her Lord. And resisting the empire's world, Huddleston lived into the reality by honoring this woman that the empire told him that he need not nor should not honor. And so he tipped his cap. He saw her, he acknowledged her, and he tipped his cap. What no one could know at the time was that there was a small 9-year-old boy standing by the mother's side. He witnessed this small gesture of great significance, and it left a lasting mark on his life. His name was Desmond Tutu. The gesture absolutely blew his mind, and he could not fit it into the way that he saw himself and his place in the world, and the way that the world worked. And it set him on a trajectory which saw him become one of the anti-apartheid movement's most important figures, the Archbishop of Cape Town, and a Nobel Peace Prize winner. It all began with a tipped cap. A small gesture that probably in the moment felt insignificant. This is embodied by Bishop Tutu's quote. He says that no one would even know who he was if it hadn't been for apartheid. That he was just doing what was in front of him to do. He was in the place in the time that made it where we would be talking about his name. But there are a number of people who are doing what is theirs to do right in front of them that we will never know their names. They won't be famous. There won't be books written about them. And so he says this, do your little bit of good where you are. It's those little bits of good put together that overwhelm the world. And so as we look at the way that Shiphrah and Puah did the little bit of good that was in front of them to do, we're reminded that even in the face of empire, Jesus Christ reigns over all powers and authorities, and even death itself. And we are invited to really and actually go out and join the one who says, "Take heart, for I've overcome the world."
Thanks for listening. For more information about our community, you can always visit our website at redemptionhou.com. Now go with this blessing. May you feel centered in God's love, and from this center, go out in resistance to despair through embodying hope to a weary world. May you notice the beauty in the mundane. Though tyrants and empire persist, may you in love find the little bit of good where you are that is yours to do. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.